Have you ever bought a manual focus lens and wondered what these markings were? Or you ever picked up a disposable camera or one of those focus-free film cameras and wondered how they work? Hi, I'm Saif, and if you haven't seen any of the other videos, I talk about photos. And today I'm going to start a new series, which is going to be a little bit more educational. And because I like street and documentary photography, I'm going to sort of gear it towards that. So I'm going to call it Street Smarts. Yeah, that's it. When you come up with a catchy name, that's what you go with. Even if all the stuff isn't going to be necessarily related to the street, we're just going to call it Street Smarts and roll with it. And today we're going to talk about zone focusing. So, what is zone focusing? Should I use zone focusing? How do I use zone focusing? Or as we say in Bangla, zone focusing koi prokaro kiki. I don't know if half of you will get that, but for my Bangla boys and girls, that was a dumb joke. Anyway, back to it. You might see on the internet there's a few videos where you'll hear about how it's faster than autofocus or better than autofocus. I'm not here to say yes or no to that. It's sort of just a catchy thing to say. I'm just going to tell you what it is and how you do it, and you can make up your mind as to whether or not it's useful for you. If you're shooting with manual focus lenses, it almost definitely is one of the best ways, if not the best way, to shoot really fast. But is it necessarily better than autofocus? Your use case sort of dictates whether or not that's true, because it's definitely not going to work for really shallow depth of field options. It really only works when you're doing deep shots at something like f5.6 or 8 or beyond. I mean, 8 is sort of the classic, but you can shoot at f11, f16. 5.6 will be good enough sometimes. It's very dependent on what you're shooting and also your focal length. So we're going to do this in two parts. The first one is going to be quick and dirty. I'm just going to show you the focusing scale on a manual focus lens. I'm going to show you how to adjust it and what that means, and that'll be enough to get you started in zone focusing. And then for the second one, we're going to break it down into the variables and what it means and how it works a little bit more. Not too in-depth. This isn't really like a scientific channel. I'm not going to draw diagrams, but I'll give you a very basic understanding first and then a slightly more in-depth understanding. So to start with the basic one, you'll see that you have a little scale here. This is a 35 millimeter lens. So on this, you have a pretty wide distance between the markings. And when you set your aperture, let's say you want to set it to f8, and you have these markings that have 8 on either side of the diamond. So the diamond is your primary focal point. So this is where it's going to be sharpest. And if you set up this range where you put the infinity on the right side, in this case because the lens goes from left to right, sort of infinity locks at when you're turning it clockwise. If you have a lens that goes the other way, you use the side where it locks essentially. So in this case, I'm gonna put the infinity at the 8 on the right side, and then you can see where the 8 on the left side is on the scale, and it's somewhere between 2 meters and 3 meters. So let's say 2.5 meters. So this implies that at f8, I'm getting anything between 2.5 meters and infinity will be in relative focus. It might not be perfectly sharp, but it'll be pretty well in focus. So that's essentially what zone focusing means. Now, if I change this to say f4, since there's no 5.6 marking on this lens, so at f4, I'm gonna say that the R is the margin for 4 on the right. So if I set it to f4 and put the infinity at the right, we get a range between 5 meters and infinity. So you see how the 8 was much larger, it was 2.5 meters to infinity, and on the 4 it's a shallower depth, but it's still quite deep. 5 meters to infinity means anything that's essentially 20 feet to infinity in front of you is just going to be in focus. So this is great for shooting pretty quickly because you don't have to pick up your camera and then refocus. You just sort of, as long as you know that your subject is going to be 20 feet and further from you, you're good. And at f8, which is essentially where I like to keep it, everything from within like 8-9 feet all the way to infinity will be in focus, which is great. And this depends on your focal length, so I'm gonna bring in a 28 now, and we'll see how much that range is, and then we'll also look at a 50. So the markings on my 28 have really been scraped off, it seems, because it's not engraved in, it's just some paint. But roughly it seems that from infinity at f8 I'm getting between 1.5 meters, so about like 5 feet all the way to infinity. And here on a 50 I'm looking at f8 5 meters to infinity, so about 15 feet to infinity. So it's interesting that it will change with your focal length. So longer lenses, if we want to get into the 135s, the 200s is going to be very different. It's not going to be as useful. So it's better with wider lenses. The wider your lens is, the shallower your general like field will, the deeper your depth of field will be in general. So it's easier for lenses that you're more likely to be using when you're walking around. And also, I just wanted to say that it doesn't always have to be with infinity. Infinity is just an easy way to use it, but you could set it to any range if you think that everything is going to be within, say, 30 meters. So you might want to make your range 10 meters to 30 meters or 5 meters to 20 meters or whatever. As long as you have the markings on your lens, you can pretty well pick any two spots, and as long as your top end and bottom end are within whatever you want, you're good. And this doesn't just apply to lenses that are for manual focusing. You can do this on autofocus lenses too, even if they don't have the markings. It's just that you need to be able to set your distance on focus pretty accurately, and there's apps that you can use to figure out your zone or your hyperfocal distances. I'm not sure what they are. I haven't used them, but I'll like write the name of one in the description. So that's how you use it in the plain and simple way. Now let's talk about the depth of field and how that's helpful. So first of all, let's talk about how depth of field works. And essentially, the further things are from your camera, the closer they are relative to other things. So the relative distance between things is what dictates depth of field. I sort of like to think of it in a way that like things nearer to you are more spread out because you're closer to them, their relative distances are smaller. So I just sort of look at the angle of view and I separate it into slices, and I sort of like to imagine that the slices are more spread out near you and they're denser the further away they are, because essentially once you get to a point in your frame, everything's essentially far. It's like when you look anywhere, things that are really close to you are distinctly different, but as soon as they get really far away, it just sort of becomes flat, or it just becomes arbitrarily distant, where it's all just classed as far. But realistically, if you're focusing on something that's 100 feet away and something is 1 foot away from that, or even 10 feet away from that, it's only 10% of the distance. Whereas if you're focusing on something that's 1 foot away and something is 10 feet away from that, then the distance between this and the second thing is 10 times the distance between you and it, right? So you see how that sort of correlates to how the depth of field works. So the further you're focusing, the more things are more likely to be together, especially when you're shooting wider lenses. But if you're shooting very, very telephoto lenses, this matters less, but you also have different compressions. But just to give you an idea of what that means. I'll also post a link in the description to a video that's far more scientific about how depth of field works. This is just the way I look at it. So now let's talk about why you should use it. And like I said earlier, if you're using a manual lens or a manual camera altogether, it's quite a bit easier because you don't have the versatility of being able to point at something and let the camera focus for you. So essentially, if you set a zone that's wide enough for whatever it is that you're trying to shoot, then you know that if you see something pass by you in that zone, you just pick up your camera. As long as it's in the frame, you're gonna get your shot in pretty decent focus, or at least good enough focus. So that's why you should use it, and that's what a lot of, you know, famous older photographers did when they didn't have autofocus. They would just zone focus. Is it faster than autofocus? I mean, technically there's no movements being done, so as long as you've done all the calculations correctly, then if you know that the thing that you're going to be focusing is always going to be in that zone, then yes, technically it could be faster than autofocus. Is it more versatile or useful than autofocus? I think it's disingenuous to say that it's better than autofocus all the time, because it's not. But for a very specific use case like mine, where I'm walking down the street and I know that if I'm going to take a picture of something, it's going to be at least 5 feet in front of me or 10 feet in front of me, then yes, it can be just as good, if not better, than autofocus, because technically nothing has to move, nothing has to happen with the inside the camera aside from me just picking it up, which I would do to take the picture in the first place. So who does it work for? Like I said, it works for people who can predict exactly where the subject is going to be, and also that field is relatively constant, because if you can predict the subject's going to be somewhere, but that prediction is changing rapidly, like you're trying to take pictures of sports, for example, it's going to be difficult unless you have a really wide angle lens, at which point focus is relatively not useful. If you're using telephoto lenses, it's going to be very difficult to use zone focusing properly, or at least in a useful way. But I mean, people were taking photos of sports and people were taking photos of birds and animals before autofocus existed, so it definitely is still useful to know what focus distances mean on your lens and how to use them. So it's a good practice to learn, but is it necessarily what those people need to learn these days? Probably not. It's really more for people who are trying to do that documentary style, that street style, and are using wide lenses, and they're trying to get increase their ability to capture pictures without having to fiddle with manual focus all the time. So that's it for me, and I hope you enjoyed that video. I hope you learned something. I hope you learned a little bit about zone focusing and depth of field and things like that in general. I just hope that it was useful to you. I have a few more ideas about some of these videos that are a little bit more educational than the average walkabout. So hope to make a few more in a little bit, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for watching.